Today we are going to be discussing why you should never give your opponent a choice in Magic the Gathering. And we're going to be doing so by reading through this famous article, PV's Rule, written by none other than Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa, PV as he is known sometimes. He is a Magic the Gathering Pro Tour champion, world champion, Hall of Famer, and a great writer, and he is explaining a very important concept in this article. So hopefully, if you've never heard of it, I'll be able to expose you to this concept and also provide some clarification along the way, explain the card examples, and all of that. Let's dive in. So first of all, PV's Rule, never give your opponents a choice. Choices are a recurring theme in my articles because some of the most unappreciated strategic concepts in Magic are rooted in them. Most of the time, I focus on maximizing your choices, knowing when you have a choice, making the most informed choice, and so on. Today, I'm going to focus on taking the choice away from your opponent, particularly at a high level of play. A while ago, in the old standard, I read a thread on Reddit that asked whether one should bluff in this spot. P2 has just played a second Swamp and a Relentless Dead. Relentless Dead is a 2/2 for 2 that was key to a zombies strategy. And all of these links cause the page to break, which is why I'm going to be explaining what all the cards are. So your opponent has an important 2-mana 2/2. Player 1 untaps with Soulscar Mage and plays a second Mountain. Soulscar Mage is a 1/2 with Prowess. So the question was, given no spells in hand, should player 1 attack with Soulscar Mage to bluff 1 point of damage? Take a moment to think on your answer. So basically, should you attack your 1/2 prowess into your opponent's 2/2 creature when you have no instants or sorceries or non-creature spells with flash in your hand, so you have no way to make it so that you'll eat your opponent's creature in combat? If they block, your Soulscar Mage dies. If they don't block, you get through 1 damage. So what do you do? The answers in the thread were pretty split. Some people said you should attack because there's no way they'd expose their Relentless Dead like this. After all, if you have any spell, it dies. Some people said you should not attack because the chance that they block is not worth the 1 damage you get when they don't block. Some people said you needed more information to decide, like the contents of your hand. Of all the answers, I don't feel like any was correct. Sure, some people stumbled upon the correct play by accident, but no one elaborated correctly on why it should be made. And this is an important point in Magic the Gathering. Everyone's going to make correct plays in situations where they don't do it for the right reasons, and even if you're making the correct play, you need to know the reasons so that you can continue making right plays going into the future. In this spot, you must not attack regardless of what is in your hand because the block is forced. Your opponent has to block 100% of the time. Even if you have Shock, Shock is a red spell instant that does 2 damage, so you could kill Relentless Dead with it. Even if you have Shock, they must block. Given that they must block, you can't attack. This is like the brain explosion part of the article, which really makes it an essential part of Magic strategy for me, because just the way he's saying this in absolutes and then explains it later, which we'll get to in a moment, is it really clarifies why your opponent can't block. I mean, why your opponent has to block and why you therefore cannot attack. This is what we're going to talk about in this article. Let's present the rule. At a high level of play, it is better to force a poor outcome than to give your opponent a choice that includes that outcome. So if you can give your opponent choice A or force your opponent to choose A, or you give them a choice between A and B, you want to force them to choose A, as we'll get to later in this article. But the basic premise is your opponent is going to make a better choice for them if they have the choice between A and B than if you force them to choose A. In practical terms, it means if your opponent has the option to make a play, and you can either force them to make it or present a set of choices among which the option you can force is included, you should force it as to not give them the choice. This is not intuitive, neither is that sentence. And it often feels bad to make a play that you know is bad for you, but it's what you should do anyway, because the alternative is worse. This entire paragraph is kind of confusing. Let's go back to our bluff example. Okay, here we are. We've got our 1/2 attacker with prowess. Our opponent has a 2/2 blocker. We are deciding whether or not to attack in. If you look at the spells that were played in the format, you see Shock and Abrade. So Shock is the 1-mana deal 2 at instant speed in red, and Abrade is a 2-mana deal 3 at instant speed in red that can also kill artifacts. If you block, your opponent can shock you, which means you take 2 and Relentless Dead dies, because Shock can deal 2 to any target. This is an outcome that you don't want, and one you should, in theory, try to prevent. The problem here, try to prevent as the person blocking. The problem here is that you cannot possibly prevent it. If you don't block, you either take 1, or your opponent just shocks the Relentless Dead and you take the same 2 damage, because you can just decide not to block and then they shock it and you still take 2 from the prowess creature hitting you for 2. So your decision tree is as follows. Path 1, your opponent spends 1 red mana and a shock, your Relentless Dead dies and you take 2. Path 2, your opponent has the choice of spend 1 red mana and a shock, your Relentless Dead dies and you take 2, or spend no mana and you take 1. So, as we were saying before, even if I would prefer a world where they didn't shock my Relentless Dead, I don't want to give my opponent that option because potentially they want to pick option 2 when it's going to be good for them. While it's true that you do not want to lose Relentless Dead, the only scenario in which this does not happen is when your opponent doesn't want it to. If they have shock, they can always cast it, but if you don't block, then suddenly they don't have to. They can, for example, play a Kari Zev if it's more convenient for them. Kari Zev is a 2-mana 1/3 that attacks and makes a Ragavan token, so it's the first instance of Ragavan. It doesn't. The Ragavan token doesn't have all the crazy abilities that current Ragavan does, but yeah, it was a aggressive red threat in the aggressive red decks back in the day that were playing things like Soulscar Mage. They might have so much burn in hand that they think that it's better to ignore Relentless Dead and shock you to deal 4. They will not deviate from the standard play of killing Relentless Dead and dealing 2 unless they see a benefit for themselves, which means you should not give them the chance to. So basically, if they want to keep building their curve out, or they want to do something else with their mana, or they want to hold up a braid, or they want to do any number of things, they get the option of doing that if you don't block. But if you block, you force them to trade shock for your Relentless Dead, which is something they always have the option to do anyway. And so instead of giving them the option to do it, you force them to do it. If we're going to quantify things, it looks like this. Option 1 forces an outcome whose value for your opponent is 7. These numbers are picked arbitrarily, just making sure everyone is on the same page. Option 2 gives your opponent the choice of an outcome of which the value for them is 3. So in this case, that is them like attacking in with their Soulscar Mage, doing nothing, and your Relentless Dead just eating it or something. An outcome of which the value for them is 7. This is them casting their shock at instant speed. An outcome of which the value for them is 8. This is them not attacking, not doing any. This is them you attacking, you not blocking, and then like them getting to do something else. In this case, you should just accept that they're getting the 7 because you're not going to do better than that. The only way your opponent declines to take the 7 is when they think they can get an 8 instead. If their choice is only between 7 and 3, then obviously they're taking the 7 anyway, so the fact that the 3 is possible should not factor into your considerations because in practice, it will never happen. This paragraph is also confusing. Basically what he is saying, and he's done it very well at times in this article and a little bit murkily at other times, is if you have the ability to force your opponent to make a play, then you should do so. Because the only time they're not going to make that play is when it's better for them not to do so because they have extra information. So pretty much maybe their turn could look like it's in limited. Oftentimes, this will come up in situations where your opponent makes an attack and you can block and force them to use their combat trick or something like that. And by forcing them to do that, you kind of throw them off curve or mess with their turn. Or things like that. It's not exactly the same because they've already chosen to attack in that case. But basically what he's saying is you have to force your opponent to make the play so they don't have the option to make an even better play. Here's another common scenario where this happens. Imagine you're playing a control deck and your hand is Lightning Bolt, which is a 1-mana deal 3, classic, and Counterspell, which is 2 mana to counter any spell your opponent plays. Both of which are known to your opponent, so they've maybe seen your hand from something before. Your opponent is at a healthy life total and has no board, so Lightning Bolt isn't very useful. Your opponent taps 1 mana and plays Duress, which has the ability for 1 black mana to look at someone's hand and take a non-creature spell from it. Should you use Counterspell on it? This is a spot in which your Counterspell is much more valuable than your Lightning Bolt. Therefore, you really don't want to spend it. Casting the Counterspell effectively forces your opponent to take the Counterspell away, leaving you with the semi-useless Lightning Bolt, which is the worst-case scenario for you. Because of this, you should not cast the Counterspell. Right? Right? He's setting you up. Wrong! This is another example of your opponent is only going to make the bad choice if it's actually even better for them. If you let the duress resolve, they're going to take the counterspell away 99% of the cases. And then in the 1% of the time where they don't, you'll wish they had. They're not going to randomly take Lightning Bolt here unless it strongly benefits them to do so. They might, for example, take away Lightning Bolt and then play Great Sable Stag, which is a 3-mana green creature that can't be countered and has protection from blue and black, which you cannot counter. It is theoretically a scenario that's better for you than Duress trading for Counterspell. There is theoretically a scenario that's better for you than Duress trading for Counterspell, that Duress trading for Lightning Bolt. But in practice, it does not exist because if the scenario ever comes to pass, it'll turn out to be even worse for you. So basically, this option of 3 doesn't exist because your opponent is never going to walk into the 3. They're only going to make it a play that appears to be a 3 if it's actually an 8, basically. So yeah, basically you counter the duress because you don't want to have to give them the choice of making a play that's even better for them, which is also something that's kind of unintuitive. You're like, oh man, maybe they'll make the wrong choice, but they're not going to if they're a good player. Yet another example is killing the Selfless Spirit, the Siren Storm Tamer, or the Curse Catcher. Selfless Spirit is a 2-mana 2/1 flyer that can sacrifice to give another creature indestructible until end of turn. It might be all creatures, but it can basically sacrifice to protect your creature. The thing's working again. Thank goodness. It was glitching out earlier. But yeah, creatures you control can be indestructible until end of turn. Oh my gosh. I was doing this video and all of the links were breaking, and so I don't think I'm going to use the links because I don't want them to start breaking. But yeah, this guy protects your creatures by giving them all indestructible. This guy protects your creatures by sacrificing to counter spells or abilities. And then Curse Catcher sacrifices to counter a spell unless they pay 1. Those are the only 3 I'm going to do this for because I really don't want these links to break the whole article. As a general rule, you should always target those creatures rather than giving your opponent the choice on which to save, even if the other creature is better. So basically, let's just say that you really want to kill your opponent's 3/3 creature, but you're going to tap out to do so and they have a Curse Catcher in play. The only time they're going to sacrifice their Curse Catcher, the only time you're going to be able to actually kill the 3/3 is when they don't sacrifice their Curse Catcher, and otherwise you'll kill the Curse Catcher anyway. So you're once again in this scenario where the only time they're not going to do it is if it's even better for them not to. Imagine your opponent has a 5/5 and a Selfless Spirit in play, and you cast removal spells, and basically you can either kill the Selfless Spirit or give them the choice of which of their creatures you kill. And so once again, they're going to make the best choice for them. Since the scenario you can force is contained in the choices your opponent has, you should force it even if it's probably worse for you, because there's a chance based on information your opponent knows and you don't, it's even worse for you if Selfless Spirit survives. Maybe the 5/5 is legendary, they have other copies. Maybe they're going to play a Wrath of God, which is a board sweeper, soon. Maybe they have another creature in hand that they want to protect more than they want to protect the 5/5. Maybe they have an Archangel Avacyn that they want to flip. Archangel Avacyn flips when one of your creatures dies, so you can sacrifice Selfless Spirit to trigger it. Whatever it is, the only way that Selfless Spirit is not dying is if they don't want it to, at which point you'd rather have killed it. I also see this situation a lot with Vigilance creatures. Imagine your opponent has a 3/2 Vigilance and you have a 3/3, and no combat tricks are going to be involved. They attack and you don't block. Then on your turn, you attack. Unless you have a great plan, this is a pretty bad play because they can always trade if they want to. In this spot, you have the chance of forcing the trade and you declined. Instead, your opponent has the choice of trading or not. You ended up leaving them the choice, and inside the choice is contained an outcome you could have forced. The sentences get confusing. Basically, you can either block the 3/2 on their turn or attack with your 3/3 and trade it for the 3/2 on their turn after you've taken some damage. So if you're going to attack, then you must always block. Obviously, a bit of an extreme because you could have other things, but if there's no other cards involved, then that's how the theory works. Next level. So basically, this is the basic PV's rule. So this is if you're trying to get better, never give your opponent a choice. It's better to force a poor outcome than give your opponent a choice that includes that outcome. That's PV's rule number 1. Level 2 is getting into the weeds a bit, which is really cool and theoretical, but it's not always as applicable. If I'm playing against a very good player and they give me a choice when they didn't need to, I'm going to be wary of it. So if 2 players both know PV's rule number 1, then when your opponent gives you a choice, you need to be like, oh, they're giving me a choice, knowing that I know they shouldn't give me a choice, which just gets into all sorts of mind games. You have a Selfless Spirit and a Thalia Heretic Cathar in play, which is like a 3/2 that makes lands and creatures your opponents control come into play tapped. Your good opponent lightning bolts your Thalia. What now? It's the reverse of what we were talking about. Your opponent, who is good, could have forced a certain play. They could have guaranteed the bolt is trading for Selfless Spirit. Instead, they gave you a choice. You can either trade for Thalia or Selfless Spirit. The only way they give you the choice here is if the alternative is even better for them. So you should not do it. So that brings us to, if your opponent could have forced a certain outcome and they didn't, that's because this is not the best outcome for them. Therefore, if you have the option of selecting that outcome, you should. Which is crazy to think about, but basically it means that you're always going to end up with this 7 scenario, because the only time your opponent is going to give you the option to do something else is when it's actually better for them still. Because of something they know that you don't know, because they know that you know that they shouldn't have given you the choice in the first place. So you should still basically act as if they didn't give you a choice. And so if your opponent gives you a choice, even if it looks better, you should still make the play that was as if they hadn't given you a choice, which is just mind explosion. But it makes total sense when you think about it, because the only times your opponents are going to do that, if they're good and they know this kind of rule, is if it's better for them. Or they're next leveling you, which is insane to think about, but generally speaking, they're only going to do it if it's better for them, because if they wanted to kill the Selfless Spirit, they would kill the Selfless Spirit. So they kind of want to kill the Thalia, but so you should still sacrifice the Selfless Spirit is basically what he's saying here. If I'm playing in a GP, the first exception, the There are two exceptions to you doing this kind of thing. I'm always going to sacrifice the selfless spirit. The first is when you believe that for whatever reason they're not going to make the right choice. Either they are inexperienced or you have information that they don't have that is crucial to the decision. If I'm playing in a GP or a Pro Tour against an opponent I know is experienced, I'm always going to kill the selfless spirit. But if I'm at the pre-release, I might kill the 5/5 because there's a realistic chance that my opponent will forget to use the selfless spirit or won't be able to properly evaluate when it is the more valuable creature. The more skilled your opponent is, the more PV's rules apply. Sometimes you have information that your opponent doesn't, which turns their better play into a bad play. Using the numbers analogy from before, if your opponent's perceived 8 is actually a 6, then they might go for it and you'll end up ahead. Imagine you have a selfless spirit and a Thalia in play. Your opponent bolts your Thalia. Your hand has 2 more copies of Thalia that you were unable to cast because it's legendary. In this spot, you have to weigh the information and judge who you think knows more and whose knowledge is more relevant. Your opponent could have bolted the selfless spirit and they didn't. This means that they believe killing the Thalia is better for them, but they know that you're only going to allow that if you think it's better for you. So they must think that they know even more than you do. Even factoring in the fact that you'll only let it happen if you think it's good for you, they're still willing to give you the choice. Because remember, they're bolting your Thalia, which is giving you a choice, which is against PV's rule for them. And then it turns into a PV's rule for you because your opponent has then given, you now have the choice of letting your opponent's spell resolve or not letting it resolve, essentially, the way they initially targeted it to. But yeah, looking at your hand, you would strongly prefer if they killed Thalia, since you have 2 other copies in hand. But you also know that they must think killing Thalia is better by enough that, even if you actively want Thalia to be the target, they still want to kill it. One of you is wrong, but who? You have to figure out the potential outcomes. So this is the complexity of Magic the Gathering, really. It's just like, this is like, the first part, I think, is the most applicable part of PV's rule, is never give your opponent a choice. That's the part that I always take away from this and I always think about. And then the second one is like, if you're playing against someone who's good, you can really get in the weeds, and it's just really, really cool how Magic the Gathering works. So he doesn't spend as much time on it, but it's interesting nonetheless, and we'll finish it for completion's sake. Keep in mind that only information your opponent doesn't know should be factored in here. If your opponent has knowledge of your 2 extra Thalias, then you should sacrifice the selfless spirit 100% of the time, because they will only do that play, especially with full knowledge, if it benefits them. The other exception is when there's literally nothing that could happen to you that is worse than the choice you can force. So this is just the final thing. Imagine your opponent is attacking you with a 3/3 and a selfless spirit. You have a lightning bolt and you're at 3. Here, the correct technical play is to bolt the selfless spirit to not give your opponent a choice, but that leaves you dead on board, so it doesn't work. Here, you have to give your opponent the choice because it's your only hope to win, and it makes no sense to force a play that kills you. This is the gist of it. Basically, don't give your opponent choices. If you can lock an outcome, do so, even if it's not the best for you, unless it's the absolute worst for you. It's a bit counterintuitive sometimes, but it's often correct. And yeah, so I think you could summarize this into the first tagline: never give your opponents a choice, because they're always going to choose something that is better for them. And yeah, this is the link that broke it for me last time. The entire article shut down, but I'm glad we got through it this time. And if you read this article yourself, which will be linked in the description, you can look at all of the card images as well. But hopefully this clarified things for you and gave you insight into an article that maybe you had never heard of. They themselves did an update of it here in 2024, but this article is a classic that I read many, many years ago and have used to improve as a Magic player. If you did make it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag PV's rule in the comment section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end of this video. Let me know if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you next time.